There was once a traveler who loved to explore the world and admire its beauty. One day on his journey, the traveler looks up and sees in the distance a glowing palace. How magnificent, he thinks to himself as he observes from afar. Then, upon looking at it more closely, he trembles with concern. He realizes the palace is on fire. Could it be that this palace doesn't have an owner? He thought as he looked around, searching for one. Rabbinic sages compare this traveler in this parable to Abraham. They believe that Abraham, like the traveler, has this remarkable ability to perceive the beauty of the world while demonstrating deep concern toward the fire burning it down. Time and time again, Abraham displays distress for the flames of injustice spreading through the world. Aghast by the blazing hatred, ignorance, and complacency threatening to destroy the world's glory, Abraham wonders, isn't anyone in charge around here? We're wondering the same thing sometimes, aren't we? Abraham cries out, how could there be such a glorious world without an architect behind its magnificent design? If there is an architect, a powerful God, how could that God let it all burn down? Rabbi Jonathan Sacks teaches, it is in that cry, that sacred discontent, that Abraham's journey begins. Sacred discontent fuels Abraham's anger, passion, and desire for change. Sacred discontent becomes a moral pang, stirring Abraham to extinguish the flames of injustice and serve as God's partner in creation. Sacred discontent is the distress that many of us feel today as we witness the fires of systemic racism burning through our nation. Systemic racism is at the foundation of many of our country's systems, including our education, health, economic, and criminal justice systems, threatening and claiming the lives of people of color. Living in a country saturated with racism, we often normalize how systemic racism undergirds our education and healthcare systems, where we document persistent disparities, but seem unwilling to reform the systems to improve the outcomes for all. The fires of systemic racism fuel police brutality against people of color. Along with white supremacy, systemic racism empowers hateful individuals to commit acts of terror. In an all too recent example, our hearts are broken over the deaths of Angela Michelle Carr, Gerald Gallion, and Anolt Joseph Laguerre Jr., the three African Americans whose lives were taken in Jacksonville by a gunman filled with hateful, racist ideology. As Rabbi Sacks explains, sacred discontent is where Abraham's journey begins. And for us too, sacred discontent is only the beginning. We pray that our sacred discontent fuels an anguish, a passion that we feel deep within our bones inspiring us to do something, to take action. We too, like Abraham, must envision the day when humanity will rise up to its potential. A day when all individuals will be treated as holy children of God, created B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image. The moral voice of our tradition urges us to extinguish the fires of systemic racism as we fight for equity, dignity, and respect for every human being. Throughout the high holidays, we engage in introspection and repentance. Tonight on Rosh Hashanah, I pray that we enter this conversation with open and curious hearts, eager to listen, eager to engage, and eager to question. We each bring our own thoughts, experiences, and even biases to this conversation. And my hope is that engaging in this topic will spark courageous conversations and reflections during the days of awe, which will inspire growth and action for each of us in the new year. Now tonight, I invite us to reflect on some of the most threatening moral and systemic fires burning right inside Florida's classrooms. Fires that not only affect students and teachers, but our whole society. As a result of recent legislation, educators are limited in the way that they can teach American history, sexual orientation, and gender identity. They are prohibited from teaching about privilege and oppression based on skin color. Florida leaders have banned the spending on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs within education. As a result of these changes, the teaching of the experiences of marginalized groups is being criminalized. Even in schools where books haven't been banned, many teachers are removing their classroom libraries altogether out of fear that a book could spark a banned discussion. Factual histories of people of color, women, and the LGBTQ+ community are being erased. As part of Florida's new Black History curriculum, students are learning that slaves developed skills that they could use for their personal benefit. This edited version of history depicts slavery as though it was a learning opportunity for Black individuals. Slavery was brutal oppression, torture, separation of families, humans for sale. It was not an internship. There is no personal benefit to being dehumanized. Derek Johnson, the president and CEO of the NAACP, says Florida's education laws are an attempt to bring our country back to a 19th century America where Black life was not valued. It is imperative that we understand that the horrors of slavery and Jim Crow were a violation of human rights and represent the darkest period in American history. Our children deserve nothing less than truth, justice, and the equity our ancestors shed blood, sweat, and tears for. We cannot encourage our children to look away from the fire as it burns down our nation. Leaving children ignorant to our nation's past and present atrocities and sparing them discomfort hinders our society from progressing. Our children should be uncomfortable by systemic racism, and so should we. Discomfort is a positive force when it leads to sacred discontent, that burning desire to transform our world. Engaging in conversations about oppression, cruelty, and systemic racism are opportunities for students to think critically, to develop empathy, and to feel called to make a difference. As we wrestle with how we can help extinguish the fires of systemic racism in our classrooms, may we draw inspiration from the strength of Ruby Bridges. In 1960, when she was only 6 years old, she became one of the first Black students to integrate New Orleans' all-white public school system. Greeted by an angry mob and escorted by federal marshals, Ruby displayed deep courage as she entered the school. She was 6 years old. 60 years later, Bridges is a strong voice in the fight for racial equity. She states, "I was recently asked to speak at a conference based on history. I was thinking about what I wanted to say. Then I thought about how I had to get on a plane to travel from Louisiana to DC. I thought about how I arrived and made it safely, but someone in another plane didn't because of a plane crash. When that happened, they had to send a plane crew to the wreckage to go through that wreckage and to find that little black box. Can you imagine what those people must have seen going to that site, going to that wreckage, to get that little black box? Why was that box so important? It was the history that little black box held to make sure that I, on the next flight, could arrive safely. If history works for something like that, what makes us think it won't work for racism, to rid us of racism? If we tell the truth, good, bad, or ugly, if we teach that it happened, then maybe history will move us past our racial differences. As Bridges teaches, we cannot ignore the wreckage. The equity of future generations is dependent on the way we learn from our nation's racist past and present. Our Reformed Jewish tradition calls on us to stand up for racial equity, like the courageous Jews who marched before us. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the fight for civil rights. The 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act were drafted in the conference room of the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center. Right here in Florida, 17 rabbis with sacred discontent stirring them to action were arrested in 1964 in St. Augustine for assembling in an integrated group as a protest against segregation, discrimination, and violence. Reflecting on their experience, they wrote, "We came because we realized that injustice in St. Augustine, as anywhere else, diminishes the humanity in each of us. We came to St. Augustine mainly because we could not stay away. We came because we could not stand quietly by our brother's blood. We had done that too many times before. We came as Jews who remember the millions of faceless people who stood quietly, watching the smoke rise from Hitler's crematoria. We came because we know that second only to silence, the greatest danger to humanity is loss of faith in our capacity to act." Inspired by these brave leaders whose Judaism called on them to fight for justice, we stand on their shoulders and continue this work. Jewish tradition teaches in Pirkei Avot, while it is not our responsibility to complete the work, we may not desist from it. We must do our part. We must do our part to bring the next generation closer to racial equity. We must not stand on the sidelines and let others do the hard work alone. So what can we do to help? Layla Saad, author of Me and White Supremacy, shares some of the many ways that we can create change. Speak up when leaders, organizations, and institutions are discriminating against people of color rather than remaining silent. Amplify the voices of people of color and listen to their experiences. Engage in courageous conversations about race with our families, friends, and communities rather than ignoring it. Seek out anti-racist educators and teachers as we make lifelong learning about anti-racism one of our main priorities. Show up at meetings, rallies, marches, and fundraisers for people of color. Use the Green Book of Tampa Bay to support Black-owned businesses. Support organizations, nonprofits, and political candidates who are working hard for racial equity. This will include supporting educators and school board members who are working hard to ensure children receive a truthful and empowering education, despite recent legislation intimidating them from doing so. One of the ways our Temple Beth-El community works for racial equity right here in Pinellas County is through our involvement in an interfaith justice coalition called FAST, which stands for Faith and Action Strength Together. Through our participation in FAST, we joined together with over 50 other faith communities to tackle some of the issues that are hurting members of our community, such as affordable housing, water quality, and criminal justice reform. As a result of systemic racism, these issues heavily impact people of color. By continuing our work with FAST and being one of only 2 Jewish congregations in the entire group, we demonstrate to our community that racial equity is a Jewish value, that the words tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue, are not just words we say at Temple, but words we live by as we work for justice. This year at the Nehemiah Action, I was uplifted by the way our Temple Beth-El presence shared the voice of Judaism with our wider community. With 60 members present from TBE, we had one of the largest representations from any house of worship. We were so proud. We helped address these important issues and held our public officials accountable. In this next year, I encourage our community to attend FAST meetings and assemblies and get involved. We really need you. If you are feeling sacred discontent and you want to make a difference, this is a way. FAST is one vehicle for action. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, "An America that looks away is ignoring not just the sins of the past, but the sins of the present and the certain sins of the future." We must not look away. Today on Rosh Hashanah, may we be inspired to answer the call to help in the creation of a better world here and now. Like Abraham, we must express deep concern toward the fires burning down the world. We must display distress for the flames of injustice threatening the lives of people of color. When we feel this anger, this fear, this disgust with white supremacy and systemic racism, may we recognize these feelings as our sacred discontent. And may this ignite within us a moral imperative, a raging inspiration, driving each of us to work for racial equity on this day, in this place, at this time. Like Abraham, may our sacred discontent lead us to action as together we answer the shofar's call. L'Shana Tovah.